Bringing on my guest here for this week's episode of Sports Talk Chicago with Joey Christopoulos, right here on WLS AM 890. Happy Saturday, everybody. You can follow him at Nicholas Moreano on Twitter. He's done amazing work for Chicago Audible, and you can also now check out his great work covering the Chicago Bears, nicholasmoreano.substack.com. That's Moreano. And also go to his YouTube page, too, as well. One of the fastest-growing YouTube pages for Bears content on the market today. It's Nicholas Moreano. What's up, Nick?
Joey, appreciate just the shout out there, but I've been good, man. How about yourself?
I've been great, man. I've been great. I've been enjoying all the work that you've been doing. I wanted to bring you on. We're going to start off. We're going to talk a little Chicago Bears, but you just got back from the Senior Bowl recently. And I think the Chicago Bears, in the next couple of months, once the Super Bowl's over, we're going to start diving into the Combine. We're going to start diving into the NFL draft and obviously free agency. So I want to come back to all your great work at the Senior Bowl. Let's start off with just a general question. You've been at a couple of these now. And now every single year as you go there, I'm sure you pick up all these little tips and tricks about how you want to try and evaluate and put your own evaluations on players. So heading into this year's Senior Bowl, is there one particular technique or one thing now that you try and drill in on these particular players when you're looking at offensive linemen, defensive linemen, that you learned over the years going to so many Senior Bowls?
Well, I think this is now year 5 for me down there in Mobile, Alabama. And for me, like the emphasis this time around was really focusing in on the offensive and defensive line play, but more specifically, like those one-on-ones, man. I think it's a great opportunity for guys that whether they played in the FCS or the SEC to really showcase, what they're about. And I think it's a great opportunity if you go there to cover like these events. It's like, see what these players are doing. Like if it's a certain type of pass rusher, what type of moves is he trying one rep? And then it's maybe 3 reps later where he gets another opportunity to go in another one-on-one, maybe against a different player. What does he try this time? Can he correct that mistake that didn't work the first time and, utilize and enhance his footwork, his hand placement to then win the rep the second time? And I think that just kind of showcases, what these players are capable of, what they're willing to try, and what they excel at and don't excel at. So there was definitely a big emphasis for me going down to this Senior Bowl, knowing what the Bears' needs were on the offensive and defensive line to focus in on, both sides of the ball, who's winning reps, how many times they're winning, what are they using to win, and just kind of highlighting some of the strengths and weaknesses for each of those players.
Yeah, it's so interesting from a defensive line perspective is, TJ Watt famously talks about really only having kind of one move, right? It's that power rip move that he uses over and over again. And he's so dominant at it. But is a part of that also trying to pick and parcel between trying to see, wow, this guy can be really dominant at this one technique or this one move, but also trying to, as you said, look and see, do they have the versatility to maybe add to the toolbox and how crafty they are? And does that also kind of play into some of the intelligence of a player too as well?
Oh, absolutely. And if players are not, displaying everything that they got and they're trying to hone in on maybe one technique, that's fine. It's just, then you're just kind of projecting how else is this player going to win at the next level. And I think when you do see players that can not only, showcase their speed and power, but can then put a finesse like spin move in like a pass rush rep, then it just kind of, I think for NFL general managers, for scouts who know about these players going into this, but then you're also projecting, okay, like it's not just he's going to have a counter to the offensive lineman's counter. And that's why it's, I think, beneficial for these guys to just try some things. If things don't work, that's perfectly fine. That's what you're going to have coaching at the next level for, to really polish up some of these pass rush moves to get it to where they want to be when they get to the NFL. But that is definitely a benefit. And for a guy like, JJ Watt, where you only need that move, that's perfectly fine. Just be the best at it, and you can make a Hall of Fame career out of it.
Yeah, it's $100 million move, Nick. It's a pretty good
exactly.
move. Yeah. Let's just stay on the defensive side before we move it over to the offensive line. I think a topic that Bears fans really, really want to hear about. But I think there was 2 players that came out of the Senior Bowl. When they talk about your stock rising throughout the process, of course, they have to go through the combine. But I just want to get your take on Walter Nolan from Ole Miss and Shamar Stewart, the D lineman from Texas A&M. I think we've heard a lot of those guys. Like when we're seeing mock drafts now, you're like, could Walter Nolan possibly go 10 to the Chicago Bears? Are you buying the hype for both of those players? And what were you impressed with each of them?
Yeah, so let's start with Shamar Stewart, because that was a guy that I think consistently throughout the 3 days, when you look at his frame, 6'6", 290 pounds, and just what he's able to display not only with power and speed, but bend and play with a lot of energy too. Like that's a guy that I think stock is rising. And look, he wasn't a high sack production creator last year, 1.5 sacks last season, but that's somebody, that you see high upside. And you also see the physical makeup where it's like, okay, maybe he didn't have the production in college at Texas A&M, but it's like you could see how this guy can be a disruptive force at the next level. And when I was watching these guys, Joey, I was thinking of them also in the image of how Dennis Allen would use them, specifically with the defensive linemen. And he likes bigger body defensive ends. 6'6", 290 definitely fits the bill of what he would utilize in his system. So really liked what I liked out of Shamar Stewart and just how he could be maybe a nice asset to a Montez Sweat. Now, is 10 maybe too high? I don't know. I don't know how this is going to all play out, but I think that he definitely, raised some eyebrows with what he was able to do. He didn't even compete in the actual game because of what he had done in the practices. Same thing for Walter Nolan. I thought there were some flashes of quickness, especially when he was even lined up inside. Like that's what you want to see, especially as a disruptor. The fastest way to get to the quarterback is obviously in the middle, right? Where you can dent the pocket and get in there and then obviously, wreak havoc. But both those guys, I think Walter Nolan would be a little later, maybe even in the first round, maybe day 2, wherever he ends up projecting. I think Shamar Stewart, though, again, when you look at that physical makeup, that might even put some NFL general managers like, yes, we need to go get this guy. Even though he didn't have the sack production, we'll see what we can make him as an NFL caliber talent.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Nick, and that's why it's so great having you out here on Sports Talk Chicago, right here on WLS AM 890, is because I did see a mock draft of someone having Walter Nolan go to the Chicago Bears at 10. And I know these mock drafts are going to be crazy. This is going to be a long process that's going to go over the course of many months. But for Bears fans listening right now, it's important to listen to people like you that are on the beat, watching these players, and being able to trying to figure out a little bit about where they should go exactly in the draft. And, we'll get to the Chicago Bears where they should trade down probably on another day. But it's important to notice how these guys are rising and falling as the days move forward. Moving over to the offensive side. I've had the opportunity the last 2 years to cover the Big Ten, which is a great year for me with offensive linemen, right? Because if you're looking at all these guys that they're being talked about right now, a lot of it is these dudes like the Josh Simmons, the Josh Connerleys of the world. And then you have the Will Campbells from LSU, and you have Kelvin Banks from Texas that I think I watched, with a little bit of a microscope during that CFP 12 playoff. But you in your Substack article, you did a great breakdown on Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, and I don't think that you're alone on people that see his stock rising throughout this process, and he's going to be a guy to watch during the Combine. Can you bring our viewers into a little bit about what you liked about him and why he could be a fit for the Chicago Bears?
Yeah, the 6'6", 305-pound versatile offensive lineman. That's what should be intriguing for Ryan Poles and Chicago Bears, because they have 3 interior offensive line positions that need to be addressed going into the 2025 season. A guy like Gray Zabel played all 3 of them at the Senior Bowl. And actually, during North Dakota State, he was playing left tackle, right tackle, left guard, right guard, did not play center, but he was doing that at the Senior Bowl. And if you didn't know that going in, that he wasn't a guy that had played center in college, you wouldn't have noticed based off the reps he was having. I would call him the most consistent player on all 3 days of practice. Right when he stepped in, didn't matter what the level of competition was opposite of him. I mean, Gray Zabel was there to compete, showed quickness out of his stance, good hand strikes, was able to show an anchor when facing some of those heavier, stronger powered guys. And even when going to the second level, and that's where when you're kind of watching these practices, it gets a little murky when you're watching the team setting because there's so many guys, right? So many guys on a given play. But like Gray Zabel, like if you were that linebacker at the second level, he was reaching you. He knew exactly the path to get to that linebacker and make an effective block. And I could just see Ben Johnson looking at a guy like this, or obviously Ryan Poles, Ian Cunningham, if he's still with the Bears by the time they're in the draft, seeing a guy like this, the versatility that he provides, and being like, well, if someone goes down, we can easily move a guy like Zabel, or we can peg him into this hole right now. And if something changes, like he has shown that position flexibility. So Gray Zabel, I don't know where he was going into Senior Bowl week in terms of his draft production, but That's a guy that easily can be one of the first picks on day 2. And if somebody were to pick him on day 1, I wouldn't be surprised because of how good his week was and just what he can provide position versatility wise to any team that needs to address that interior offensive line.
Yeah, look, this might be a tough question to answer because we still have to go through the combine when we talk about length, strength, and quickness. But do you have a favorite offensive lineman right now? Is it Will Campbell? Is it Kelvin Banks? Is it Josh Simmons coming off an ACL? Do you have a favorite right now that if the Chicago Bears had him on the board at 10, you'd be fine with them taking him?
You know, I am leaning towards Campbell, Will Campbell from LSU, but it's still so early on. I just think that as we kind of go through this process and we look, I'm going to really base everything off the tape and what they're doing on the football field. But as we know with the Chicago Bears, so much is made out of the person that they're also looking at. Is it going to fit in the culture that the Bears are trying to establish at Hallis Hall? So that's obviously going to be a huge thing. But if you were to, like, right now, if I had to go with one, it probably would be Will Campbell. I think if you add a guy like that to, again, fortify this offensive line, which is going to be so important for Ben Johnson as he enters his first year as a head coach with the Chicago Bears. Like, that's a good way to start. That's a really good way to start to do that. And we'll see at that point, maybe they've already added some key free agents on the interior. So you can look at that move being a building block to what, should be a way better offensive line than what Caleb Williams was dealing with in 2024.
Final one on the Senior Bowl before we get to the Chicago Bears here. We're talking to Bears beat reporter Nick Moreano here on WLS AM 890 Sports Talk Chicago. Happy Saturday, Chicago. I want to talk to you about running backs. In my opinion, I think everyone's saying this is a deep class, but I think this is one of those drafts when you look at the depth at running back, it's one of those drafts where you really have to drill in and get it right, Nick, right? I think that I think you can easily pick the wrong guy at the wrong time and the wrong moment. It's a right spot, right time situation. So many guys to choose from. In my opinion, I think they need to add a guy to that room. So in your opinion, I'm going to keep this simple, man. Who is your favorite running back? I'm not saying Ashton Genty at 10. Let's move off of that. And let's go to day 2, even 39, 41, and further on the draft. Who would be your favorite running back to target that you think could be that diamond in the rough for the Chicago Bears?
I mean, there's a couple of different options you can go with this. Because we're just talking about the Senior Bowl, a guy that really impressed me all 3 days was a Delaware running back, Marcus Yarns. He's got a similar body type to a Jahmyr Gibbs, actually a little bit taller, has that speed. He's a threat out of the backfield as a pass catcher. When I was watching him, and I didn't know a lot about him going into the Senior Bowl week, but seeing him run routes on these linebackers, again, it's isolated. It's really a drill meant for the running back to excel. I mean, Marcus Yarns capitalized on it every single rep, every single time. And I just think with Ben Johnson coming from a team in Detroit that had a Gibbs, had a David Montgomery, those two very different backs, but very capable backs, you just want to at least give Johnson the necessary weapons if he feels it's not there right now. So that's one guy. But as you know, Joey, I'm an Iowa guy, Iowa grad. Sometimes
another Caleb coming to Chicago, maybe
another Caleb and Caleb Johnson. I mean, I just think that, with what he could bring as not only a guy that can run between the tackles, also as a play threat on the outside, like that could be enticing as well. Just for what you just want to make sure out of this draft, free agency, whatever it may be, like Ben Johnson feels like he has the tools, the players at that position to run his offense. Because I think when defenses were going up against Ben Johnson, they weren't just thinking, oh, we got to stop Jared Goff and St. Brown and Jameson Williams. It was a balanced attack. They are going to run the ball as much as they're going to pass it. And you don't know which one's going to hit you first and how effective it's going to be. And that's what made it so dangerous. So that rushing attack for Chicago, which was not good enough with Swift, Roschon Johnson, and company. And again, you have to factor in the O-line and things like that. It needs to be better. And if it needs to be better because you need to get better players, you make that happen. And this is a draft where, there are some capable backs, and it doesn't have to be Genty at number 10 to get a guy that can, be effective in this offense.
Yeah, another guy from the Big Ten that I love, that I think people are suddenly somehow sleeping on is I love Travion Henderson, Nick. I just think he's just one of those guys that when you look at it, he split some time now with Quinshon Judkins, so doesn't, he's got plenty of tread on the tires, all that cliche, all that good stuff. But I love him in open space. I think he can hit that second gear in the open field. So when we're looking at those Big Ten running backs, I'm definitely intrigued by him. The great thing about Caleb Johnson too is I was looking at all these guys, and I was trying to look for traits and these past things, and I was like, man, I was thinking back to Matt Forte. And, Matt Forte coming out of Tulane, I think Chicago Bears fans didn't know a ton about him because, he played down in Louisiana. Maybe they thought that he was a guy that was more of a diamond in the rough. And then you look it up, he had over 2,000 yards his final year at Tulane as a running back. So when you talk about Caleb Johnson, the production is there, right? The week in, week out, I'm going to give you exactly what you're asking for every single week. He's not a boomer bust pick. That's why I like Caleb Johnson too as well.
Yeah, and to be fair, Iowa's offense, the offense was Caleb Johnson. So when you're watching Iowa football, it's like, oh, what is Caleb Johnson doing? If he's not doing much, then Iowa's not moving the ball. But yeah, over 1,500 yards, a 21 touch, production speaks for itself. So, and I completely understand if people are not tuning into Iowa football. I barely did it myself, but I sometimes had to force myself to do it. This would be a guy that makes a lot of sense, and he has production to back it up.
Not to keep knocking your team, but once they lost Torrey Taylor, their number 2 offensive weapon, things got a little bleak this year. Even though they randomly scored some points in the second half of some games this last year. To be very fair, it was
diamond in the rough type of stuff. But again, Torrey Taylor, a Senior Bowl guy. The Bears have looked at the Senior Bowl to find player, whether it's a punter or a guy like Vail, they found guys, Austin Booker as well. So it's let's look at, they were there, and I can tell you Ryan Poles, Ian Cunningham, super, super focused on just watching the offensive defensive line day 2, day 3. I would not be surprised if they come away with some player at some point in the draft from that group.
So let's move it over to the Chicago Bears. News keeps matriculating about how Ben Johnson continues to form his staff. Just for context, let's kind of bring everybody into the tent. If I forget anybody, Nick, help me out. But, obviously they brought in Declan Doyle to be offensive coordinator. Dennis Allen is now the defensive coordinator. JT Barrett is the quarterback's coach. Antoine Randall L. will coach the wide receivers and be associate head coach. Dan Rushar is now the offensive line coach. And Eric Bieniemy, just a couple of days ago, was named the running backs coach. Out of all those hires, which one do you think is your favorite and the one that might be most impactful to help Ben Johnson in his first year as Chicago Bears head coach?
Man, I think there's some good candidates, and I think that's should be enticing for Bears fans. But the Eric Bieniemy as the running backs coach is really, I think, a really good get for Ben Johnson's coaching staff, and it's not just because he comes with play calling experience with obviously the Chiefs and then a brief stint with UCLA, but also just that he was a former player, former running back, and I was just talking about the Ben Johnson needs to get the most out of those running backs. I think Eric Bieniemy is going to be somebody that coaches that group hard, just from what I've read and just hearing from players that have been with him. He's a tough coach, and he has a certain style to him. And I think listening to what Bears players were saying at the end of last season, they want somebody that's going to enforce discipline. And I think that Eric Bieniemy is going to be somebody that will at least hold his group accountable, but someone that's been in a bigger role as an offensive coordinator should be allowed to, enforce that discipline to other groups if, he sees something that's not being held up to the standard. I'm sure those position coaches will do that as well. But that experience combined with, how he approaches things, and also just being an asset to Ben Johnson, who will be a head coach for the first time, Eric Bieniemy, I'm pretty sure, can bounce off ideas with Ben Johnson, see things through, his eyes and how he would approach something, but, also know his role, right? He is the running backs coach, but he should be looked at as an asset for Ben Johnson. So having that experience in the room at that position, again, a very important one, like I was just mentioning, that's going to be, I think, such a huge addition for Ben Johnson as he navigates what being a head coach is all about in year one.
Yeah, look, we're going to be talking about this for months. It's February right now. The Super Bowl's this weekend, so it's tough to kind of wrap our heads around it. But, I've been doing a bit here on this show that the Chicago Bears continuously be the offseason kings every single year, right? They're not winning Super Bowls, they're not winning games. So for 4 months out of the year, September, October, November, December, Bears fans are miserable. But every other month of the year, we are filled with nothing but endless hope. And I think with this coaching staff coming in, I think the hope is, I'm seeing it on my text threads and seeing it all over socials, that Bears fans are getting excited again. But from your perspective, this is tough to say, but like, I'm still a little curious and a little skeptical about, you talked a lot about being in those locker rooms last year, about players wanting to be coached harder. So my question is for Ben Johnson moving forward, when he gets into training camp, are these the type of players that are going to immediately absorb that coaching? Or do you feel like that maybe we should slow the hope train down just a little bit, where maybe this first season could be a little bit bumpier because Ben Johnson might have to weed some players out? You know, maybe some players from the Matt Eberflus era aren't necessarily the caliber of player either on the field that Ben Johnson wants or that work ethic. How do you think that's going to kind of play out with this whole new coaching staff on a roster that honestly I don't see a ton of turnover with, right? We're going to see some free agents and we're going to see some drafts like every single year, but this is mostly a Ryan Poles, Matt Eberflus show for the most part as it stands right now. How do you kind of see that power dynamic playing out heading into this summer?
I agree with you that the core players that are here are definitely going to be prominent in 2025. But I think it's a good sign that players were already outspoken that they wanted that type of coaching. Had they like stayed quiet, we didn't know what was missing from the last coaching staff, I think that would be more of a red flag when it came to, you know, Ben Johnson's group now being here and just the type of coaching that they're going to have to establish. Seeing and hearing that players want that's a good sign moving forward. But I think what's going to need to happen too is like when it is those dog days of training camp and mistakes are happening, that they get corrected immediately. Because we all heard Ryan Poles, I think it was during the Thursday Night Football broadcast against the Seattle Seahawks, allude to things were happening in training camp that, you know, were also resurfacing later in the season, something along those lines. So when things do happen, when things are not being ran the right way, if play calls are whatever it may be, player coaches faults, like they get corrected. And that's not a thing where, you know, egos need to be maybe egos do need to be stepped on, but as long as it's for the betterment of the team moving forward, that's all that really matters. So when we're seeing maybe Caleb Williams misfire over the middle of the field, and it could be for a number of different reasons, that play, those reps, that next practice, that next time they're in a certain period, make sure he hits that play so that you're not going into week one or the first quarter of the season still having to correct the mistakes that were wrong way in the beginning. So I think that will be important to really have this coach, the coaching that needs to be done for this group be effective. And if that's the case, I think you're going to see less of the mistakes that we saw really transpire the whole entire season, whether it's false starts by the offense, the defense being undisciplined and jumping off sides, things that are like that. Those can be corrected and be built into football players early on, but it does take a certain dedication from the coaching staff and the players buy-in to really make that work.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what I'm trying to lean in on here, if I can go on the optimistic side for the Chicago Bears, is just go up and down the roster and start at the head coach. Every single person on this roster has a lot to prove, right, Nick? Mm-hmm. Caleb Williams has a lot to prove in year 2 with all the Jaden Daniels narratives and the sacks and the downfield inaccuracy, so on and so forth. Ben Johnson, a lot to prove, living up to the contract. Can you be a full-time head coach? DJ Moore, you're no longer a 1,000-yard receiver, right? You know, Cole Kmet, what happened to you last year? I mean, and that's kind of the hope, right, is that as they enter training camp, that there's a big, huge, giant chip on the shoulder, because I just don't think where I'm kind of sitting right now is I want to get on this hope train. I want to be optimistic about the Chicago Bears. I just don't think they deserve the benefit of the doubt anymore. And I think a lot to prove might be a mantra that might benefit the Chicago Bears heading into training camp.
Well, Joe, I feel like and look, the Bears do this a lot where they have coaching turnover and they have to go and find a new staff and all these things. And there is always this optimism, half glass full approach to, oh, look at what, you know, these guys can provide to the players here. So yeah, like I'm going to temper those expectations of what this group can do. I still think that the talent that they have is way better than the 5 wins that they ended with last season. But we need to see it. A lot of these guys haven't been together in previous stops. There are, of course, some that overlap, but you need to see how they view things, how they're going to be in the meeting rooms, how they're going to see a game plan a certain way as opposed to, how they saw it at their previous stops. So yes, a lot of these names are enticing, are intriguing, do provide hope, but you do need to see it when it comes to the, actual games being played, because again, you said it perfectly at the beginning. They win the offseason. Who cares about the offseason? It does not matter what you're doing now if it doesn't translate to, the football season. Like every single time I go into a season covering the Bears, I'm realistically almost thinking like January is probably where it ends. Early January. It's not, there's no playoffs being played here. It just hasn't happened. And until they show me that, you can't give them the benefit of the doubt, like you just said.
Yeah, no, it's just what we do best here in Chicago. It's just really building up the offseason, getting super excited, and then week 1 shows up, and we're like, holy cow, some of the things we were worried about, some of the problems that we were scared about, they show up on the field. And you know what? And the thing is, as a fan, I can tell you, Nick, is what I think is so valuable to people like you that are on the grass at training camp. For years, my whole life, you guys will come back and you'll report. And look, you're obviously so very professional about it, but there's always a little bit of like a mixed vibe, right? Of like, I saw some good things, I saw some bad things. I would love just 1 year to have you come onto the show, Nick, and be like, hey, how was training camp today? And you'd be like, man, Caleb looked amazing. Caleb shredded him. Caleb's on it. You know what I mean? And I never hear that every single year, but we continuously build ourselves up towards it. And I just want to see something along the lines of where all the signs kind of lead towards the product on the field. You know what I mean? And I think that's the hope for the Chicago Bears.
Yeah, and Joey, that's a really good point. Like if I do see that happening, I will definitely report it as is. But it also means that maybe like the defense isn't where it needs to be. And it's so that's the thing you have to balance here. Like the defensive end, like the defense can't touch Caleb. And that's a good thing. You don't want him to. You don't want him anywhere near him. But you do want to see the offense stack days, have some good efficiency in the red zone. Like I remember now, like thinking back to the training camp days, like there were just like back-to-back plays where Caleb and Cole could just not connect in the middle of the field in the red zone. Yeah. And you see the season that Cole kind of had being neglected. Maybe that's play calling, maybe that's, himself, maybe that's a little bit of combination of everything, but there are signs. And I know maybe you can't take the most out of training camp and see that it plays out in the regular season, but there are certain things that you can see, and when they don't, transpire in the regular season, you can go all the way back to those dog days of July and early August. So I hope that could be the case where, there are days where, hey, Dennis Allen, that defense was cooking, but then the very next day, Caleb responds with a spectacular throw and catch to Rome or whoever it may be. So that would be the hope.
I want to ask you about the Super Bowl. You had me thinking about something. I asked a guest this last week. I want to ask you just really quick. In Chicago, we need to have a whipping boy. We need to have a scapegoat. And Ben Johnson's now our head coach. He's probably going to get a pretty long leash here in Chicago, and he's calling the plays. So it can't be the offensive coordinator anymore. I think we're going to give Caleb the patience that he needs and deserves in year 2 to hopefully mature, progress, and become the quarterback that we want him to be. So who is the new whipping boy in Chicago for next year? I think it's probably going to be Dennis Allen. I'm being silly about this, right? But when Chicago Bears fans, they got to be mad at somebody, and I have a feeling it's probably going to have to be Dennis Allen. Who do you think the next whipping boy for the Chicago Bears could be?
I mean, that's the first name that came to mind. Like if well, I guess it depends for Caleb. If he's taking some of these sacks with a better offensive line, knowing that he has time, like I could see some fault being, easily placed to him being in year 2 with Ben Johnson, and you have all these weapons in front of you, and the offensive line has been built up hopefully at that point. Like I could see it still going a little bit to Caleb, but with Dennis, like this last year with the New Orleans Saints, obviously wasn't the best that he's had in terms of units for defensive production, but he has had some really good units in the past, especially when, Sean Payton was there as the head coach. So I could see that being like the next place where Bears fans will easily place blame. Like, again,
it's got to go somewhere. It's got to go somewhere, Nick.
It's got to go somewhere. And I think, if you add another defensive end of opposite of Montez Sweat, if you're not seeing the production there, like what's going on here? And Dennis Allen, he's has been in the league for a long time, obviously been a head coach too. You need to see, I think, production out of that unit, and it needs to be far better stopping the run than what was happening, especially after the Hail Mary happened in last season. Like the rush defense just wasn't as prominent, especially at 2 when Andrew Billings went down. So we need to see those things happen for Dennis Allen so he can avoid being the whipping boy, and then you'll have to just maybe place your blame somewhere else.
That's the one. If I had to take a guess right now in February, is that I think we're going to put a lot of resources into our offense, especially the offensive line, especially with draft capital. Chicago Bears had a hard time stopping the run last year, and nothing pisses Bears fans off than a defense that can't stop the run. And I just have a feeling that sometime in October, we're going to have callers calling in to radio stations here on WLS AM 890, and they're going to be complaining about Dennis Allen. It's not even going to be his fault. It's just how water is wet. Water is wet, my friend. That's how it goes. Before we get you out of here, just really quick, Super Bowl is tomorrow. Here on WLS AM 890, you're listening to Sports Talk Chicago with Nick Moreano. Hope you're having a wonderful Saturday night. Super Bowl is tomorrow, Nick. So I'm going to lay it out for you, man. How are you thinking? How do you feel like this is going to play out? Is it Patrick Mahomes in the dynasty? Did the Eagles finally avenge the loss of a couple years ago? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a fun game, I think, when it all comes down to, especially like in the fourth quarter. I can see this definitely being close, but I don't know. I've done this too many times, Joey, where I've doubted Patrick Mahomes, whether it's been the regular season, in the playoffs, and I've just
State Farm commercials. You're like, he's not going to do anymore. There's no way he can do more.
Exactly. And for however it plays out, he does. And I think you also got to look at it too. Like, who do you trust more? Like Steve Spagnuolo calling the Kansas City defense, or Kellen Moore with the Eagles off. Like, there are certain things you look at matchup wise where you're like, okay, I like the Chiefs there. And the most important one is a quarterback position. And you're always doesn't matter usually who the matchup is, you're going to side with Patrick Mahomes. And I know this season hasn't been the Patrick Mahomes, like, the MVP, like that type of season, but he's in the Super Bowl again. And he's not even, quote unquote, playing, I guess, his best football that he's played in his past. So I'm going to take the Chiefs again. I do think Saquon does make a huge difference, though. Just having that type of, man, he's so good. Just having that type of player and knowing that you can control the clock, maybe keep Patrick Mahomes off the field just long enough so he doesn't come back to win a game. It is really intriguing, but I'm not doing it again. I'm not picking against Patrick Mahomes. The dynasty happens, and it just cements his legacy as being on track to be the greatest football player of all time. Like, he has a couple of rings to catch Tom Brady, but it's hard to think that he won't get there if he wins this one on Sunday.
Those are all great points. You're right. I mean, this hasn't been the ideal offensive season for Patrick Mahomes, and he's still in the Super Bowl. Imagine having an off day and still having everyone else's best day. Something to aspire to in life. Look, I'm with you, man. I think a cliche that was unsexy and not really talked about maybe 4 or 5 years ago is now like almost over talked about when you talk about the lines, the offensive line, defensive line. I do think Philadelphia's got an incredibly talented unit on both sides of the ball on that front. I would maybe even give them the edge slightly on the offensive line, and maybe it's a wash or a net neutral on the defensive line. But even if it's that close in a razor-thin margin, I'm with you. I'm sticking with Patrick Mahomes. I'm really curious to see. DeAndre Hopkins hasn't really been heard of a lot in this playoff so far, and now he's gotten a couple of weeks, and this is a guy who's a little bit older, but he is an absolute technician route runner, and he is a guy who I think on third downs, Super Bowl, when plays really matters, I'm not saying that he catches an 80-yard pass, but what I am saying is if he can catch a couple of those 9, 10, 11-yard passes on third down, those back-breaking drives a little bit that keep the chains moving, I think that's one of the weird little X factors, and I'm with you, dude. I love Saquon, right? But can he do it for 4 quarters? Can they? Mm-hmm. I think he's going to have a great first quarter, right? Spags will adjust. The Eagles will adjust. But how many adjustments can go back and forth for 4 quarters to keep Saquon as big of a threat in that game, to be that big of a factor to beat Patrick Mahomes? That's where I'm a little dubious. And Chiefs Kingdom, man, 3 years in a row. It's pretty crazy, man. Are you a greatness guy? Do you like the underdog? I'm a guy who As long as I'm alive, I do love being around and appreciating and watching greatness. I would love that if it was my team doing it. But are you a guy that's always kind of rooting for the underdog? Do you land on one side or the other on that?
I think it depends on like the specific matchup, but like you, I do appreciate like what Patrick Mahomes and this Chiefs teams are doing. Like it's you don't when it's happening, maybe in the moment, you don't appreciate it as much as you should. But it's like, even for me, like I didn't like when I was born 94, like Jordan, like I don't have vivid memories of that. But then you hear about it today, and it's like incredible how they were able to have that dominance. This will be the same type of, I think, rhetoric when talking about these Chiefs teams when we're far removed from it. So I do appreciate that. I appreciate greatness, and I appreciate how he's been doing things. And, that's why if they win on Sunday, which I think they will, like, it's just another page in the big book that Patrick Mahomes is building that will ultimately be his legacy. And again, probably will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest football player ever to play. So I do appreciate it. And, that's why, like, if he doesn't win, like, again, I also appreciate that as well for Jalen Hurts and, getting that redemption kind of story. But yeah, like you, I just think the Chiefs are too much as long as you have number 15 back there.
Yeah, that's the thing about greatness is just when you talk about Jordan. I'm older than you, Nick, so I was a young man. I watched a lot of Jordan, and it was just like in those Pacers series when they played the Pacers. It was like 97, 98. They were 8 deep, and as a team, they were just better. They were just better. But Jordan would just figure it out. The same way that Tom Brady would be like, you know what? Oh man, we're down by 10. I'm just going to go down and I'm going to score. You just figure out a drive, manipulate it, get that 8 to 10 play drive. Patrick Mahomes is that same way. They just go down and they just figure it out. And as long as you keep it close, you need to blow out Patrick Mahomes to take it away from him, right? You need to chop off his head, chop off his legs and his arms, and toss his body into the ocean. If you keep it close, he's going to figure out a way, very similar to how he figured it out last year. Nick Moreano, we got to get you out of here, man. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us for Sports Talk Chicago here on WLS AM 890. Please, everybody, if you get the opportunity, head on over to YouTube. Check out Nick Moreano's YouTube page, Moreano. Spell it right. I have a long last name, so spell it right so you can find it. Check out nicholasmoriano.substack.com and follow him at Nicholas Moreano. Bears beat reporter Nick Moreano. Man, thank you so much for joining. I greatly appreciate it, man. Love having you on the show, and it was a great time.
Hey, appreciate you, Joey. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much to Nick Moreano for joining Sports Talk Chicago right here with Joey Christopoulos right here in WLS AM 890, rounding third, heading home. So I just want to hit a couple of things really quick before we say goodbye. I hope you guys all enjoy your wonderful Super Bowl Sunday, America's holiday, moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we didn't get to with Nick Moreano was the first piece of news that came out. I just want to respond to it was the concept of Cleveland Browns defensive end Myles Garrett demanding a trade from the Cleveland Browns. It looks like the Cleveland Browns are going to play ball and eventually trade him. So, of course, naturally, Chicago Bears fans, kings of the offseason. Should we do it? Should we bite it? Should we jump in? Why not, everybody? Whoever's available, Chicago Bears should have him. Well, a couple things to keep in mind here. The first and foremost is Myles Garrett is a fantastic player. Let's not get this wrong. He is one of the preeminent pass rushers in the game. I don't think he's better than TJ Watt, in my personal opinion. I still think TJ Watt is the best defensive end in football, but Myles Garrett is probably second or third with Micah Parsons. That one's a little bit of a closer razor-thin margin, and I will get to Michael Parsons in just a second. The only issue with Myles Garrett is a couple things. One, it would be great if he wanted to play for the Chicago Bears, but one, he's 29 years old. Look, as a 41-year-old right now, do I sound ridiculous saying that? Yes, I do. But when we say 29 years old, there's a couple of things to keep in mind from this aspect. One, he's got 1 year left on his deal after this coming year, and he's immediately going to want new money. So I think whatever team takes him on, he's going to immediately want to shred that up and probably get paid $30 to $35 million per year. That's a lot of money. It's not my money, but is the best allocation of money and assets for the Chicago Bears if they want to get to where they want to be, which is playing in the playoffs, competing for a Super Bowl, and making Caleb Williams our franchise quarterback for the next 10 years. When it comes to those things, bringing in Myles Garrett does not help that. I'm sorry. It doesn't. Myles Garrett's a great player, but if you're telling me the Chicago Bears are going to win the Super Bowl in the next 2 years, I can wrap my head around bringing in Myles Garrett. But if they aren't, if you want to see us competing in the playoffs and maybe heading towards the Super Bowl, you just want to maximize the best out of Myles Garrett while you have it. You don't want to eventually reach the top of the mountain when he's 32 or 33 years old and then returns are diminishing a little bit. And on top of that, I've talked a little bit about this over the summer, is I'm not so much of a salary cap guy, and I don't care how the Chicago Bears spend their money. I just hope they spend a ton of it. But if you look at where the dollars are allocated on this roster as of right now, look at the highest paid players in the team. The guys that are making over $20 million right now are Jalen Johnson, Montez Sweat, DJ Moore, and Tremaine Edmonds. All those guys are, if not making $20 million a year, Tremaine Edmonds, I believe, is making $17 or $18 million a year. Those are 3 defensive players right there. So you're telling me that trading for Myles Garrett, you're going to add a 4th defensive player to that mix? Now, in this trade, are you swapping Montez Sweat out for Myles Garrett plus draft capital? That's probably the only scenario where I would actually consider this type of a deal. But in my opinion, and for those of you listening, you know, I like to harp on how we don't spend dollars on the offensive line. I want to start moving those $18 million players maybe a little bit over to the offensive line on the offensive side of the ball. I'm not counting Keenan Allen in this case because I don't think Keenan Allen will be back next year. If he's not back next year, as it stands right now, we only have one player making over $20 million. Our quarterback's making money, but other than that, everyone else on the team is making $7 or $8 million. They need to put some serious capital into the offensive side of the ball. I personally would rather take that $35 million and give 20-something million to a Pro Bowl guard Trey Smith, who's currently on the Kansas City Chiefs, and 12 or 13 million to Drew Dahlman, the center on the Atlanta Falcons. That's $35 million right there. That's a Pro Bowl all-pro guard and a Pro Bowl center. You'll have Braxton Jones, Darnell Wright. You can go out and sign somebody else in the super cheap, or maybe you should start drafting some guys too as well and bring them along. But if you take that $35 million that Myles Garrett's going to want and you bring 2 Pro Bowl offensive linemen, I think that is the move and the path for the Chicago Bears moving forward, not taking on a guy like Myles Garrett. And I think that is the path for the Chicago Bears. I know we want to grow offensive linemen, but again, sometimes drafting these guys and throwing them to the wolves right away isn't the strongest path towards success. It would not be the worst thing in the world to bring in some guys, some legitimate guys, paying them money for 2 or 3 years, and then drafting someone in the second or fourth round, because the Bears don't have a 3rd-round pick this year. Bringing in a young offensive lineman, having them learn and get a little tutelage, get a little bit stronger at the NFL level, and be able to come in either as a swing or as an eventual replacement for those players moving forward. I think that is the move moving forward. Also, to reiterate what we were talking about with Nick Moreano, is I think the Chicago Bears also are going to need to attack the running back position. I think Roschon Johnson is fine. I think the thing that you wanted him to do, run between the tackles and get you some tough yards, pop 6, 8, 9 yards on a particular carry in the middle of the field when you need it the most, hasn't quite lived up to that hype. He's got 6 touchdowns last year, so he was good in the red zone, can't really catch the football, and honestly, his blocking left a little bit to be desired after having a strong rookie season in that regard. DeAndre Swift, I think he will be back on the Bears next year, but I do not see a long-term future with him on the team, so you're going to have to roll that over. So when you're looking at running back, there are a ton of guys, from Amarian Hampton from North Carolina, Travion Henderson with Ohio State, Quinshon Judkins, Ohio State, Caleb Johnson, Iowa, Brashard Smith. The names go on and on and on. There are tons of guys that you could target at 39, 41, and deeper into drafts that you can bring in right away and can be difference makers for you. Of all the drafts to go after a running back, I think this is the draft to attack that. And finally, before we get out of here, Chicago Bulls. I want to be brief about this one for only one reason. I'm pre-taping this right now before the trade deadline happens. So my hope is that by the time you are listening to this on a Saturday night, enjoying your wonderful weekend here in the beautiful city of Chicago, that the Chicago Bulls have traded more players than just Zach LaVine as of this taping. But regardless of whether they do or whether they don't and whether return is, my fear is, going back to the Chicago Bears, is the Bulls are doing it again in this disjointed way that again does not set them up for success. They are literally, if they are tearing down this team, in my opinion, Arturas Karnisovas will not be general manager of the Chicago Bulls in 2027. Maybe, just maybe, they let him come back for the 25-26 season. But after that, I cannot see him staying with this franchise moving forward. And if that is the case, it is a huge disservice to the Chicago Bulls and the Bulls fans to allow this guy to tear this team apart, because whoever they end up bringing in is going to have to play with the cards that he'll have dealt are the weird second round picks and the pick swaps that Karnisovas is going to get if he trades Nikolai Vucevic, if he trades Kobe White, if he trades Lonzo Ball. He traded Zach LaVine, and all he got out of it was his money back and also the pick that he originally lost to the San Antonio Spurs that was top 10 protected the next 2 years. And now it is no longer protected. The Chicago Bulls own it no matter what. So they literally bought their own pick back. It's like in that movie, if you've ever seen it, Father of the Bride 2 with Steve Martin. He sells his house, 3 months later has a change of heart, goes back to buy his house, and then he has to buy it with $50,000 on top of it. That is what AK is doing right now with Zach LaVine. Never should have signed him in the first place. Should have traded him 2 years ago. He didn't. He signed him. Didn't work out. And now he has to trade him just to get out of the money. And all he gets back was a pick that he lost from a different deal 2 years ago. Doesn't make sense. Chicago Bulls, again, I'm going to say it again, and I'm not alone in this. Chicago Bulls need to lose as many games as they possibly can for the remainder of this season. I'm telling you, and I promise you right now, there at this time, and there could be more, 4 or 5 legitimate players in this upcoming draft that if they were drafted by the Chicago Bulls within 2 years will be their best player and have an opportunity to become possibly top 10, top 15 players in the NBA. That's what it takes to win. You need a stud. You need a horse. There are guys in this draft that can do it. It isn't just Cooper Flagg from Duke. There's the guys from Rutgers. There's dudes all over the NBA, and college basketball. And as we'll see in the tournament moving forward, there might be some more names that emerge and rise to the surface. Of all the years to do it, this is the year. The Chicago Bulls need to be as bad as possible. They need to get out of some of this money. They need to give themselves as many lottery balls as possible. You don't have to be the number 1 pick to make a difference in next year's NBA draft. I am promising you this. Would it be nice to get in the top 3? Yes, I would definitely try and root for that for sure. But they need to lose as many games as possible to get as bad as possible. On the other side, the Chicago Blackhawks, they've been doing that for years, and that time has come and gone. Unlike the Chicago Bulls, the Chicago Blackhawks need to try and get as good as possible while these young kids are coming up and playing. But the Chicago Bulls need to lose. They need to lose big. They need to lose hard. They need to lose as many games as possible. And it is going to be a tough race to the bottom. The Washington Wizards definitely trying to lose. Utah Jazz definitely trying to lose. More teams are going to join that party. Do not be late to this one, Chicago Bulls, like you've been late to everything else over the last several years. Try and have some foresight and get ahead of it and start losing some basketball games. That's going to do it here for Sports Talk Chicago with Joey Christopoulos right here on WLS AM 890. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful Saturday night. Enjoy your American national holiday tomorrow watching the Super Bowl. We'll see what happens. I'm rooting for the commercials. I'm rooting for the over on the national anthem. You could follow me at Joey Sports Guy if you want to, but I appreciate the time. I appreciate the listen. Have a wonderful Saturday night, Chicago. We will see you next week.